I really have nothing to say because all the strategies have been given to you today. I'm just going to basically, if you don't mind, kind of talk a little bit and riff about essentially, what it really takes to get to that level in a practice when you're going from being the clinician, being the guy who kind of makes magic in the chair, and then taking that skill set and changing it completely, and then being someone completely different into a point where you're actually looking at a point where you're building a team and building a vision rather than rebuilding a tooth. And that's going to be a lot of the challenges a lot of you have out there. So my presentation is a lot for people who are actually trying to take that next step. I was talking to a great guy, Gabriel Diaz, yesterday, and it seems like he is at that step where he's looking to get that level, so I'm hoping to get something out of this. Dr. Diaz, is he out there? There he is. And, but more importantly for a lot of you out there, because I think a lot of people are probably in that same situation that Dr. Diaz is in, where you want to get there, you know you can get there, but you just have no idea how the tools are going to work for you. And to be honest, the guys before me from Oregon, those guys are great. Open Door has provided you guys some great tools. Before I go into my presentation, I would recommend each one of you buy that book. And basically, it's called Tractions by Gino Wickman. And it's a phenomenal book in terms of teaching you and your team how to go about setting up meetings, to setting up goals, to setting up, for lack of a better term, scoreboards. And so if you can actually buy that book, it'll take a lot of the pain of you trying to figure it out on your own. So what I want to talk about essentially is that the idea of being a CEO. And I think a lot of us out there, dentists, assistants, in our entire industry, kind of think of a CEO as being essentially this really ruthless, kind of business-minded, for lack of a better term, you're this kind of ugly person in the industry. And so one of the things I'm always kind of, doing is kind of telling us, you already have an advantage of being a dentist and managing people. This is a great thing by Gary Larson, right? You guys remember Gary Larson? And so it was actually the parenting advantage of dentists. And so I just thought this was a funny one here. Guys, your son breaks something on the ground. Dad tells him, okay, well, you got to go downstairs. We're going to have one of our appointments. And so when you inherently already have this value in you, but like I said before, we get so convinced that we're one of these guys, right? Who's that? Montgomery Burns, right? And I want to kind of dispel the idea that by being a CEO or being in this kind of guy in the industry or in your operation is going to put you in that position where you're so focused on business, where you're this kind of guy who's pinching pennies when you're kind of, reviled by everyone in your office. But what it really comes down to is you have to look at things a little differently. You have to look at, just like you heard in the last presentation before I went out here, you're looking at more visionary kind of things. And that's the kind of things that have set the table for your actual operation itself. So before I go into this, some of you out there don't know my story, and I think it's important to understand my story to understand how I got here. So one of the things that got me in this position was, you might have heard about my story in which I've had 2 back surgeries. I'm one of the statistics John always talks about. But even before then, I want to kind of share with you basically what got me to this point. A lot of times, I think when you guys see these larger practices, you kind of get in your mind, well, oh my gosh, well, that larger practice has, got to that point. They have all these great advantages. It's obviously because they've got a good team member there, or they got great doctors, or they just bought the practice and it was already big in the first place. And what I want to share with you guys is that it doesn't necessarily work out that way. You can be very small, and if you choose, you can get larger as long as you're doing it the right way. So a bit of my story is that I started in about 2004, and I started in a practice that was about 800 square foot. I had 2 operatories, and essentially, I think at our zenith in that year, we were probably doing at a maximum of $35,000 a month. And that was kind of the first year of my kind of entry into actually doing this thing on my own. And then essentially what worked for me is I started getting to the idea of thinking to myself, well, I can either just kind of basically keep going on this track. I can either B, try to figure something differently about it. And in those days, when I was actually first starting out, and I talked about this a little bit like last year, is that I had so much time on my hand because I wasn't doing much that I remember walking through the parking lot of the facility I was in at the time. And I looked at the actual, basically a placard that showed all the people who were actually tenants in that building, and 60 of them were dentists. And so I thought real fast, like, oh my Lord, I'm not gonna be able to make it here. And so what I ended up doing at that point is I started to kind of think out differently, like, what am I going to do to compete with this? And so even before I kind of got really involved with ChrisAd, I think you have to start to think to yourself, you can't do what everyone else is doing because you're going to get crushed. And what I started to do is to start to think of, like, what can I do to differentiate myself? And back in those days, it was like, okay, well, maybe I need to spend more time on cosmetics. Maybe I need to be a better, person who sells, the dream to these full mouth rehabs. And I learned very quickly that that wasn't going to work really well for me. In fact, if anything, it got me in a much worse state. So from 2004 to 2005, before ChrisAd really got involved with me, it got much worse. It got to the point where I was thinking about leaving the dentistry. I think I talked about this a little bit last year, but I thought about leaving dentistry because I just couldn't figure it out. I couldn't basically do anything to kind of make the practice work. And so it got to a point where either I started learning how to reinvent how I was doing things, or I was going to go bankrupt. And so in 2005, thankfully, I spent some time with John Christensen. I spent some time with the ChrisAd guys, and just started to kind of rethink how I was doing things. And again, what I want to impart with you guys is that level of being open to that, and then being open to new ideas, being open to change, and realizing that change is going to be painful, but if you do it in the right components, and you do it with well-researched ways of doing it, it's going to work out well for you. And so I was at a point at my career at that point where I decided either A, I start asking for help, or B, I was just going to be drowning into this, and it was not going to get any better for me. So I did a lot of the things you already heard already. You open the flow. You end up basically, in my situation, when I had only 2 chairs, what I did is I turned a private office into a chair. I hired an associate. I did all the things. I don't want to really go into all the details because you literally heard from all the earlier speakers typically how it's going to work. And so from that perspective, you're just kind of constantly just building into that program exactly how to build. This practice was done on exactly the same philosophy you're going to hear, and I don't want to repeat that because I think you guys already know at this point what it's going to take. So you're going to encounter these things. You're going to be running into the things like when you hear a lot of these speakers, when you hear my presentation, it's like, well, that sounds great, but I don't have any money, I don't have the staff, I have poor talent in my area, I can't find the doctors, I can't find the hygienists who want to work on weekends. And I tend to think, that a lot of that is based on our limiting beliefs. You have to, in many respects, be willing, in many respects, to persevere. And the takeaway message I would tell from my presentation was like literally pushing through, literally understanding that pain will happen, but you simply have to persevere and have faith that you're going to be doing the right things, and knowing full well that Chris has already provided the formula for you that'll allow you guys to do just fine. And trust it, because these people are going to help you get through that. So the one thing that I found out in the practice is that, or at least in my journey, is that at times you're going to do well. You're going to do fine. You're going to start to grow a bit. And things are going to feel really easy at some points. And you're going to think to yourself that the money's coming through. I'm doing well. The practice is really growing for myself. But you're going to run into some hardships. And unless you're willing to prepare yourself for those hardships, it's going to be a rough sell for you. Because in many respects, a lot of times when people are going to face adversity, the biggest challenge I see with a lot of doctors is they're not built for it. In many respects, there's a certain level of, I don't want to call it a quitter's mentality, but it's a kind of a hopeless feel that I would tell you and I challenge you that you're going to have to find a way to push through that. So the reason I say that is that a lot of times people think that when you get a little larger, when you get to the size of Justin, you get to the size of a lot of great practitioners out here, like obviously the guys from Oregon, the Dales now. Dales, you guys are awesome. Oh my Lord. They're doing so great. But I think what ends up happening is that you might think that once you get to that point that it's going to get a little easier. All you're simply doing at that point is building upon success, building upon success, building upon success, but it doesn't get any easier. And so what I want to share with my situation is that in this past year, we actually had a situation where I went through it all over again. I think I talked about last year where we actually had a situation where we had a really big turnover on doctors, and about a couple years ago, we resettled that. We got new doctors aboard, and things went great. And I'm really proud to say, since I saw you guys last time, we had a growth of $2.4 million last year in our company, and that was wonderful, right? But at the same time, during that same growth phase, and I know that you just heard that I was out of the chair, I had to get back in. So when I got back in, yes, was I a part of the growth in terms of the clinical side? Yes. But it also allowed me to get back in there and actually allow myself to actually push the company to new limits by actually allowing ourselves to set the tone. And this is a good lesson for me as a leader. It taught me to basically be in the front and actually be leading the way, be willing to work those weekend hours. Because one of the first things I did when I came back was I took every Saturday and Sunday they needed me to work. In fact, I think when I first started working there, the first thing I did was I wanted to work every Sunday. And at that point, by showing the doctors that Sundays were going to work, by providing all that level of leadership that when you go on Sundays, you're going to have tons of exams, tons of dentistry provided for you, that set the tone for the practice to grow. And I think that set the philosophy. And so I would challenge you, you owner docs out there who have associates, to think along the lines of leadership is not just the vision, it's not just the strategy. A lot of times it's being able to step in front of it and show the way at certain times. And that for me, I thought was a really important concept that I learned. And a lot of times, what I'm going to do now when I go back is a lot of things I want to change when I go back will be done with me leading the charge when I go back and doing those things. So that's something I thought was really important to learn. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about essentially when you are going into a position of being a leader, it's not as simple as just getting, as you learned from the guys before me, that you've got to have strategy, you've got to have goals, you've got to have vision. And I'm just going to kind of show you essentially in this slideshow kind of what we do in my company to basically provide basically a really organized way of doing that so it's not based on me. One of my biggest things that I want to avoid from now on, early in my career I got into being, as I was the answer man. I was the guy who was the lightning rod of the practice in terms of figuring out every single thing that went wrong. I was that guy. But now we're devising a system led by my team who now runs this process for me. And my job now as a visionary and a CEO is to make sure we're just living out that. So one of the things that's really big here, and first of all, I want to thank Walt Knish. Walt let me use some of these slides from Unified Smiles. He does his presentation somewhat like this when he talks to his people. So Walt's out there. Thank you so much. This has been great for me. But the important thing is that we have to get into the point where when we're looking at being a leader in your organization, it's got to be about, for lack of a better term, it's really got to be about you have to be willing to put so much more time into implementing and defining strategy and leading others and operation management. But again, your job is to kind of create and help actually think along the bigger picture. But then in your office, just like they talked about before, you need implementers, you need managers, you need people to kind of be on your team to help you execute these kind of things. So what we do in my practice is that they brought up a great thing on EOS or in that book, Traction. We use a thing that's similar to that. Has everyone heard of a book by Vern Harnish called Scaling Up? Does that sound familiar to anyone? So Scaling Up is a book that's kind of like the predecessor to Traction. And what we use at least myself, is I use a one-page strategy plan. And this thing allows me to go ahead and put all the big picture, all the visions I have, all the goals I have, and to articulate it so that my team understands kind of what we're trying to shooting for. So this is something big for us that I would use. And this can be done for a small practice, for a large organization. It allows you to organize and articulate your plan so that you're not just in a haywire mode, constantly running from next crisis to next crisis. This has been really helpful for me. So one of the things that I oftentimes see when I'm talking to other doctors about what they're running into, what their struggles are, is that's the challenge, right? I think if you're in that kind of struggle between being clinical-minded and operations-minded, is that the clinicians typically struggle because they're constantly feeling that they need to be putting their time and effort toward being a better clinician, which is incredibly important, don't get me wrong. But if you really want to step into a position where you want to grow your practice, where you want to develop associates, but more importantly, you want to develop a leadership team around that, these are the things you're going to have to get good at, okay? Because you're going to have to learn how to deal with certain things that come through in terms of dealing with your organization that's not going to be related to dentistry anymore. It's going to be related to a lot of things, and there's a lot of hats that you're going to probably have to figure out, but more importantly, you're no longer wearing them because you're delegating it out properly. So in my organization, what I'm really proud of is that I've got a team that actually has developed and stepped into certain roles, like sitting in that row there, Dorina Silva, she's my director of operations. She's amazing. Like what she will do is she essentially will she's like my integrator. But the problem is she's also a visionary too, so she wears both hats. But she actually helps me get to the point where I'll come in and I'll say, this is this great thing we have to do, this process. We can actually start driving hygiene toward the evening hours, and this is how we're going to do it. she'll be able to look at those things, take what I provided her, and start implementing it based on some of the systems and some of the meetings that we're actually going to show you and how the templates work for you. So again, these are things that we have to actually identify as leaders when we're actually working and actually developing these systems for your office. You cannot spend, like, I always kind of feel it weird. Like, I think when you get to this point, a lot of times doctors, they want to be that CEO, they want to be that leader, yet they put such little time into it. You have to basically dedicate your time into kind of creating a system or for creating a scenario or strategy that'll allow you to focus on this stuff and not focusing on things like, oh, how do I go about buying the next Cedric machine? How do I go about buying or getting the next training for placing implants? You gotta be focused on this stuff. I mean, your job is to help work and mentor and facilitate other doctors to help you get to that point. So one of the things that I'm always kind of talking to my team about is that what I want them to expect from me. So like a lot of times, I'm always kind of having to teach me or actually get to the point where I'm actually doing what I'm telling them I want myself to be. Like I always talk about the level of like being consistent to what I'm actually promising them to be. And what they want to do for me is always let me know that they want to keep me in a position where I'm not be focusing on the clinical, that I'm focusing more on the business, that I'm focusing more on the leadership. And so they allow me to do that, and that's what happens is that clinical leaders have to recognize that gap in perspective and work actively to make sure tasks are appropriately triaged by priority level. So a lot of times what you're having to do is you're having to put together continually, when you're in this position, you're putting together the important and non-urgent issues. You're having to find a way to constantly delegate that out. So you have to be someone who's going to become, for lack of a better term, again, you're focused not on the actual clinical side. You're really focused on creating a better system and working ways to actually know your numbers so you're actually being a better decision maker for your practice. One of the biggest things I find when I talk to doctors sometimes is there's a lot of feeling into it. Like I feel like the practice is doing, I feel like we're really busy. I kind of feel like the practice could be this way. I mean, it really doesn't work that way. You hear it time and time again, you gotta know your numbers. So, the other component, besides just knowing the numbers, and I think we've talked about this again and again and again in this seminar, is that you're going to have to step in that role where you're no longer the guy who's the head producer. You're no longer the big cheese in the clinical side anymore. You've got to get really good at leading and inspiring others. So one of the things that I'm always kind of making sure that I'm being better about is that I'm no longer the doctor who's going in there and like coming into the office and setting the tone on productivity. My job now is to kind of help make sure I'm getting the right people in the office. It's the old adage of getting the right people on the bus, right? You want the people that you know are going to help improve your organization. And more importantly, it's my job to identify that talent, cultivate that talent, and being able to kind of constantly work with them, constantly kind of teach them, constantly mentor them. You're going to have to get used to teaching. You're going to have to get used to mentoring. And you're going to have to use, and I say that over there, having that difficult conversation. And when I say that, I'm not telling you about demeaning your team. I'm talking about asking them about what's challenging for them, like being willing to work out their issues, being willing to help you work out their struggles, and being able to talk that through and having the patience to listen to it and not inject your way of doing things immediately. That's a really big point of what you have to get comfortable with. So one thing that I find that is really critical when you start developing a team is that as a visionary and as someone like myself who's kind of a person who makes a lot of quick decisions on my own, a little bit too fast sometimes, is that I want to make sure that when you are in this position, when you're developing these people management skills, a lot of it is listening. A lot of it when you have these meetings, and we'll talk about meeting strategy in a second here, but you've really got to get comfortable with the idea of letting them run the meetings. Your team has to run the meetings. You can't be the one injecting ideas. You can't be the one constantly going in there and telling you how things are going to work. You got to listen to your team. You got to see where they're going with it, and your job essentially is just to make sure you guys are on track and meeting the goals that you've actually set for them. But the important thing I see a lot of guys doing when I actually work with some other doctors and talk to them about it is that they kind of feel, again, they're in the answer guy. They're the lightning rod. They feel like they have to inject what's exactly going to happen to make that thing work or to fix that problem in their office. And I think that's a critical component you have to start getting better at. So the strategy, I think that's the thing we talked about before. I think the strategy that's incredibly important to start to do is that you have to have a game plan. I think that one of the biggest things you're learning again and again and again in this seminar is that you have to take the time to understand where you're at. Your numbers will dictate your strategy, One of the biggest things I think that becomes a problem is that sometimes you're going to go back on Monday and you're going to start jumping into just, okay, we're going to open up 2 more hours in the evening, or we're going to get a bunch of hygienists and we're going to hire more people. But and again, I want you guys to do that, but look at your numbers, figure out exactly what it's going to be on the books for what it's going to cost you, knowing full well it's going to work, but you have to be prepared. You got to get your team to understand exactly how it's going to affect you. Because that's one of the biggest things I think guys run into, is that they jump into it without really putting some time and effort to kind of really strategize going and doing those plans that I'm talking about doing. So one of the biggest things I want you guys to go Monday is look at your numbers, find out exactly where you actually can inject that. I mean, obviously, we know the weekends, we know that the evenings are going to work out well for you, but take a strong look at that and figure out exactly where you need to put them, where it's going to come, how much it's going to cost you, and put time and effort into figuring that stuff out. Otherwise, you're kind of just running in it willy-nilly for yourself. Building a team is incredibly important. I've already talked a little bit about that. I think the biggest thing that we're actually really trying to get better at my office is that I went through a point in my career where I was a really, I don't want to call him ogre, but just really kind of authority-based on how we're going to get things done, very top-down. But now I'm really working a lot on just basically trying to create a situation where we're trying to create great performers, great leadership. Again, I'm going to talk about another guy in my practice who's actually sitting there, and his name is Josh Roach. And Josh has been a phenomenal guy. So Josh is our manager of compliance and employee training. And so what Josh does is that he comes to my practice, and he's literally kind of a team builder. I mean, his whole attitude is kind of based on bringing people together. He takes my images, he takes my vision about what I want to accomplish in terms of the team, and he articulates that based on bringing people's commonalities together, getting them to establish accountability and expectations, but at the same time also trying to find that individual's touch points and what gets them motivated so they'll actually kind of work with our team and get things in the right direction. So again, that's about identifying those people in your organization who can be those implementers. Like I said, in the Oregon practice, they've got a guy who does their implementation, which is awesome. But at the same time, I think as you get a little larger, you're going to have to find certain people in your practice who take different parts or different strategies, different specific points of, I guess I want some kind of specialist like Josh who handles those things for me and doesn't let me do it anymore. Okay, this is the stuff I want to talk about. So when I talk to doctors who are seeing growth, one of the biggest things I get, or at least the questions I get, is, Doc, I'm getting growth, I'm doing well, the practice is getting to a point where I'm doing a lot more production, but I don't see the bottom line changing me very much. What's happening to me? So I think a lot of this, owner docs, I think a lot of you guys who are starting to grow are seeing this happen right now. You're getting growth, you're adding people, you're throwing money at the expenses, and that's normal. By the way, growing a growth industry, you're going to, like John talked the first day, you're going to have to put in money to get money, and you're going to have a situation where it's going to be a high expense and it's going to be a little bit of a loss in the beginning. But what's important to also understand is to look at your expenses and looking at the actual bottom line, so you know you're actually going to have a sustainable way of the practice growing, but you also making money. So what I would encourage you guys to do is, rather than just waiting at the end of the month for your accountant to send you a P&L statement, to start putting time and effort. You can have a team member that you can do this with. You can have like in our practice, we have a financial accountant who actually handles this stuff and goes through all this stuff. So he takes all the data from my P&Ls and even from the actual practice numbers itself and puts together statements for me, so I can see exactly where I'm at. And it doesn't show this in the bottom. I wish I had the slide that would show this, but I don't have it. Is that we're looking at essentially where we were in 2019 at one of my companies or practices, and we're seeing a situation like exactly how much we made in income versus adjustable collectible production. And then we also know, and I wish I had that slide, I'm so bummed I don't have it. But in any event, there's a slide below that it shows you exactly how much we have to make in production and collections next year to see a 5% profit, a 10% profit, and a 15% profit. So we look at those numbers in terms of going about where we want to be, in terms of like how can we set the goals by doing things that are going to show the team exactly where we need to get so they can actually hit that to hit the profit we need to assure all those great bonuses they all want. So I also kind of want to discuss, people are asking also, as you get larger, oh, there it is. That's a slide. I have it. Good. So there it is. So you're looking at my average expense. So in order for me to get these are the actual numbers we have to hit the profits I need. And so a lot of you are out there thinking, holy crap, 5% profit, that's not a lot. 10% profit, that's not a lot. Even 15% is not a lot. But we'll talk about that a little later. It can be, and I'll tell you exactly how you can make that work for yourself. Okay, so anyhow, these are the things that we have. BAM is just, everyone knows what BAM is? Bare ass minimum. So that basically lets us know exactly what we have to hit per month to hit our targets, okay? BHAG, is everyone know that's big, hairy, audacious goal? That's something we do. So we have the numbers already in position for our team to see, to know exactly where we need to go to get those profits and to actually make sure we hit those big bonuses. So as you go into these kind of things, when I say high-level profit and loss, get comfortable for those owner docs who are trying to go in this direction, being able to evaluate those reports and regularly. I know Cedric does this in Dallas. Cedric's a big guy in reports. This is the stuff that we look at to kind of make sure the practice is going in the right direction. So let me talk about this real quick. So here's what I want to talk about. So when people look at this who are like in a situation, they're usually saying, okay, well, I want to get to that 30% profit. But what I would tell you, as you get larger and you start basically getting out of the chair and you get to the point, you start looking at this more as a business in ways to actually create cash flow and create profit. That is my profit. But this profit, what you don't see is I have already paid myself, okay? When you're an owner doc, built into the expenses, just like you have everything else in your P&Ls, you have to build in a management fee. This is done by any larger practice. It's done by Todd Bickling did the same thing in his practice. What I do is I pay myself, and that's what helps. You have to start talking to your accountant, and a good one, by the way, figuring out exactly, because for me, what I want to get to, and Todd showed it to you a slide, what I want to make sure is I have 15% EBITDA, which is 15%. So EBITDA essentially is the money that's left over after everything else has been paid for. But built into my EBITDA is my management fee. So there's my profit. I've already paid myself at this point. So my profit at this point, you say it's 6.28, and you're like, oh my Lord, he's not making anything. I have 7% of that monthly revenue goes to me. And at the end of the year, structured on how I've been set up for my corporation, I also have a salary that I get paid in December. So by the end of the year, I average out to a point where I'm always seeing 15%. I net 15% of the revenue from each month. Does that make sense, everyone? So my point being is this. As you go larger, you have to stop thinking of looking at things like, well, I'm only going to take you have to, this is part of the strategy from the financial side. You've got to be willing to look at your business and what your value is in terms of bringing your management skill set, your time and effort, your influx of capital. You have to put that into the monthly expenses. If you're not doing that, you're going to get killed. You're going to be left with only 6.28, okay? But you have to build that into the expenses. Other thing I want to talk about is that when you are looking at these P&Ls, a lot of the big things people always think about is I just got to keep driving and driving production. But I think a lot of times, I learned this from Walt. That's exactly what Unified Smiles is about. And again, this is a plug for Unified Smiles, but it makes a lot of sense. You really have to start looking at decreasing. When you start growing, you're going to put more money in the supplies than you ever thought you ever would. And a lot of times, what Unified Smiles will allow you to do is decrease things. Like, for example, at one point, my supplies per month were at like 11 to 12%, because everything kept growing, and I kept throwing money in towards supplies. But just being with Walt, we now are at a point where our supplies are only at 6%, which might be high for some of you, but for me, that's 5%. And that 5% goes to profit, right? So those are the kind of things you got to be really careful about. And also, when you think about increasing profit, a lot of times we think, this is a good thing to kind of think about for yourselves. Let's just use a $1 million practice model, for example. At $1 increase, you're going to see basically 10 cents of profit, okay, assuming a 10% margin. You would need to increase production by $100,000 to gain the same benefit as lowering overhead from 60 to 59% of production. So if you decrease expense here, just $1 decrease leads to $1 of profit. Does that make sense, everyone? By just decreasing expenses a bit more, you'll be able to increase that profit. Because as you grow larger, You've got to be watching this kind of stuff, because especially when you're out of the chair and you're not depending on a paycheck that's based on your clinical dentistry, you've got to find a way to manage your practice better. And this is the kind of stuff you need to be paying attention to. So one of the things that I learned again from Walt, okay, is that you have to start looking at a lot of different things based on the practice business. And I apologize to a lot of the team members out there, because I know a lot of this stuff may be like, what is he showing us? This has nothing to do with the team or the culture. But I'm telling you, these guys, is your doctors need to know this stuff so they can actually help pay your bonuses better to you. So the important thing here is to always to make sure that you're looking at a way that you basically, at your expenses, that you have to find a way to find control over that, knowing fully well that there's going to be certain expenses you're going to have every month, but you have to find a way to get that lowered by basically being really smart on being able to control what you can control and not getting tied up into a situation where you're just simply throwing money at things. That's going to get you in trouble. And I think a lot of doctors feel that, because as the growth occurs, they're just running and throwing money at it, just hoping things are going to end up having them more money at the end. But as you're just learning, putting more production without looking at the expenses gets you in big trouble. So I put this there just because some of you guys, and I'll share, let me share, I'm going to take a little bit of a tangent here. In July of this year, and this actually happened to me this year. So in July of this year, again, we talk about how it never gets easier. Just because you get bigger, it doesn't get any easier. In July of this year, I had a scenario where I unexpectedly had, well, I knew it was coming, but I didn't think it would happen at the same time, where I had two doctors who ended up moving out of state. And they're both great doctors, and I like them, and it was a really good relationship with those two guys. But they end up leaving in literally like 1 month after each, and it got to a point where I was in a situation where I had to jump back in the chair. This is what I was sharing earlier, when you have to sometimes get back in there and kind of lead the way. But it got to the point where, man, I thought I was so stressed, because here I was, I'd been out of the chair. You guys know my story. I've had back surgery. Suddenly, I'm literally back in there full time, working every weekend. And I started looking at things like, well, maybe I have to sell the practice. And I talked to Justin about this. I talked to, is that me? No. And I talked to Sigurd about this. I was at that wit's end. I mean, I was really considering maybe selling it. So I started looking at these things. And again, thankfully, things worked out. I've kind of persevered and got through that. But for those who may be thinking about that stuff, this is the stuff you need to talk about from the valuation of your practice. The days of them looking at your practice and providing you 70 to 80% on the dollar for your practice, those days are gone. They're looking at things basically on how much money is left over, how much profit you're making. And so if you're thinking along that line, this is the stuff you have to start thinking about. I left that slide, and this stuff is in your books, but essentially the important thing to understand is that the better you are at controlling expenses, the better you are at both basically productivity, but also controlling expenses, that's what gives your valuation the higher number. It's not just having a really robust practice and having a ton of patients coming in, it's this stuff. And again, I'm not thinking of selling it, but that was something I learned. I brought that up as being something of value to those who are thinking about it. So we've all heard of Peter Drucker. I mean, for those who read business books, I read a lot of business books. I think this guy's phenomenal. He's kind of the godfather of business management. So one of the things that I'm always really good about is like trying to make sure that I'm identifying the strengths in your team. I think one of the big things we do is we take for granted with some of our team members what their strengths are, and we just allow them to run with it. But rather than building on those strengths, we oftentimes take it for granted and just allow them to kind of basically be in that same position or same chair the whole time. What I like to do is to kind of look at a position where if I have someone who's completely strong in a particular like management side of things, my job is to find that person to lift their game and actually develop that. Meaning that your job as the owner and the visionary is to find ways to lift their game by getting them more education, by investing in ways that gets them in front of people that actually can change their perspective and can get them to a point where they get a lot stronger and a lot more confident. And so that's a big thing that I think really helps those who are actually in ownership, is if you have to start looking at your team and not taking for granted they just happen to be strong. Your job is to bring them up consistently, constantly looking at ways you can get them better. And not in a way of pushing them and being overbearing and just pushing them to points they're not comfortable, but looking at ways that you know you're going to improve their performance by making it easier for them to look at things the way you do so they actually mimic what your goals and what your goals are going to be for them in the future. So one of the big things, again, I'm a big believer of when I'm always talking about developing skill sets for you as owners is to always get away from the feelings. One of the biggest things Peter Drucker talks about is if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And so one of the things my team always understands is that when they have something about the practice that they want to talk to me about and they have something they want to basically do different, they have to be willing to talk to me about it using numbers. So one of the things I would encourage all of you to do when you're working with your teams and your teams come to you and say, I feel like we could just probably do this in the practice and it would do well. Well, I'm like, okay, well then show me the numbers. They're used to me hearing me say that because you have to be able to have them prove you statistical data for you to do things in your practice, especially the larger you get, the smaller amount, I shouldn't say smaller amount, the larger amount of problems that can occur really quickly unless you're really good in those decision making. So we have to make sure in your practice you're constantly having ways of metrics. You've got to find ways that are going to allow you to kind of follow those things well. We talk about metrics, we talk about statistics. I'm going to show you a little bit of those things here for you. I'm going to get past this. This is just more expenses kind of stuff. I want to get to some other things here. So these are some stuff you guys might know about. And again, I'm going to, give that shameless plug to Unified Smiles. These are the kind of stuff you can literally be very careful about and know exactly what you need to be getting in your practice. So I just threw up some numbers. Some of you might already know this. I put this out there for those who are trying to get there. So you look at Unified Smiles, like again, the larger you get, you might have a higher amount depending on where you are at. But what I'm always trying to do is finding ways to reduce those. We talked a little bit how you can reduce those, talking to Unified Smile to help that. They can be a big change in how things are going. Salaries here. So I want to get comfortable with the idea of talking to you guys about. I think a lot of times there's a constant perception that we need to get salaries of our team at this 22 to 25% number. I would tell you that if you're in a growing, most of the guys I know who are growing, I think you have to look at it to a point. You can't look at it at this static environment. At certain times, you're going to influx more towards salaries. I would say in my company, and I'd have to ask a lot of the guys who I talk to a lot, like Justin and Sigurd and Declan, they're probably a little higher than you think they would be. I'd say 30% is comfortable for us, and we just say that because at times it's going to get higher because you're constantly investing in growth. The numbers are going to go up in the salaries. I would say one of the biggest challenges I think that holds guys back from that is that you're stuck in reading too much dental economics when you're seeing these percentages that show you exactly where you need to be, but you have to remember those things are designed for practices that are small and are worried about basically every little small percentage that keeps them, for lack of a better term, pretty stagnant. So start looking at that a little differently, but again, control your expenses, work with Walt, get Unified Smiles to help you. And I know I sound like I'm a commercial for those guys, but it's a huge difference as you get larger and the expenses go up quickly on you. So let's talk a little bit about culture. So one of the biggest things I would share with you guys is that I really didn't put a lot of effort into this. This is my blind spot a couple years ago. Like I really just kind of thought to myself, it was all about just driving the numbers. It was a lot about as long as I got them paid well, it would work out. But one of the biggest things is that you have to get to a point, we talk a little about culture, and the culture is incredibly important, so we work a lot, and that's probably Josh's job of doing that, as well as Drina, of creating a great culture. But one of the things I want to talk a little bit about also, besides having a great culture and besides creating a great team, if there are no processes in place. So one of the things I'm always talking to doctors about when they're running into situations with their team, when they're running into things feeling disorganized and they're running into dissension, do they have a standard operating procedure? Do you have something in place that shows you how to deal with the problems in your practice, the challenges in your practice, by essentially having the processes there so you know exactly what to do when that thing happens? And most times we don't. But if you do, that'll allow you to get to the point where you're not dependent on, and I love her, but you're not dependent on Drina. Like you don't have to have Drina save the day or Josh save the day. You have your process in place so that you're able to scale things. So we always talk about scaling up. You can scale talent, but you got to have processes in place. If there's one thing I would encourage you guys all to do, for my takeaway for you on Monday would be, when you go back on Monday, and it won't happen overnight. It's still, and we're still, doing all right. We're constantly evolving our standard operating procedures, but start that process. Spend a little time each week putting these standard operating procedures together so you're going to get your team in a position where they feel well organized so they know exactly how to basically react when the practice goes through certain changes. And more importantly, when you're just dealing with how to talk to patients or whether it's how to do a treatment plan or whether it's how to pick up the phone, you got to have those in place because, I put this in the bottom, Do not create a culture of superstars. And I'm going to tell you why. That might sound weird, like, oh my Lord, I want a team of superstars. They're great. That's all amazing. It's like, we have this wonderful person. Why would I ever, want to not have more people like that? No, and when I say this, you can create great teams. You can create situations that have superstars in them. But the problem is, this is where it gets kind of dangerous. If you depend on that, and again, I say this, if I depend solely on Drina, and again, Drina is amazing to me, but if I depend solely on her to set the tone, let's say, God forbid, Drina moves out of town. And we've talked about this, What do we do? What are you going to do, Doc? And this happens to some of you, I bet, where you had that amazing office manager for 10 years, and you just kind of show up, it's turnkey for you, and then she takes off, right? Her husband gets a job in another state. She has a life crisis. She no longer wants to work for you. And what do most of you guys do? You freaking panic, right? Right? But if you had taken the time to make a standard operating procedure on exactly how the office needs to run, from your front office duties to your back office duties, you're able to put people in there. It's still going to be painful, but your curve of recovery is tenfold. You're going to get through that. So that's a really important thing. If there's one thing I can tell you guys to do for my presentation is please just do that. It'll make it easier on you. Okay. So this is one thing I always still do, even today. Even when you get to the point of developing this team and being able to have the difficult conversations, and they talked a little bit about it last presentation about doing people analysis, I would still recommend you do that even on the people that are in your organization right now. Constantly do that. Figure out exactly what the trigger points on, what they're helping you do, what their weaknesses might be, and finding out, to be honest, as you guys go through these different changes, you're going to evolve, and some people are going to evolve with the company and some just don't. But if you're constantly doing this, you're going to be able to figure out which ones are going to be able to coach up and which ones we just need to coach out. And again, that sounds terrible, but if you're dedicated to growing and going to a point where we're going to be a larger entity, you're going to have to start to find people who are going to be adaptable. And if they don't want to, it's okay. They can go someplace else and be a lot happier. But you have to be identifying that and not just find a resignation note on your desk on a Monday morning and go, what the heck just happened? So if you're doing these things, you're already knowing that, and you're figuring it out before they actually figure it out. Okay? Let's talk a little about associate docs. So one of the things that I've learned, and I think as a lot of us get larger, I think the biggest mistake you can make, and I think we've talked about this again and again and again, is that you just simply can't get to a point where you just simply bring associates in and just let them go. That's the biggest, I would say, that's something I did in the beginning, one of my biggest mistakes I made, and I want to get experience share here. I was at a point when the practice was really starting to go through some growth. I would just want to get a warm body in there. I was just hiring doctors just to put them in there because I knew I had the patience to get them actually really rolling. But what ends up happening really quickly, unless you're onboarding them right, and unless you're getting into the associate mindset again, you're going to run into a ton of problems. So I would tell you the biggest thing, and I talked about this about last year, but I want to talk about it again, is that I would encourage you, all the doctors out there who've got multiple associates or are going to be getting associates, you've got to be good about these things. I put 4 of them there that I think are really important, because the associate mindset is that, and again, I talked about this last year, when they come into your company, especially when you're a growing company like some of you are going to become or some of you already are, you can never forget kind of what they're going through. And this is like I lost track of when I first started getting associates on. You have to always be empathetic to what their situation is. Again, they know coming in that they're joining a really busy practice. You have to understand that. You might think that it's really easy for them to just jump in there and essentially just do incredibly well, but unless you're taking the time to kind of figure things out, your discussions with them really have to be about helping them and not them about helping you. If you're not doing these things, that's the stuff that gets them really disillusioned quickly on you. The other thing I'm going to encourage you guys to do is that you have to make time to get as much information for them as possible and stop. And this is what I got, this is what, and I'll give you a little bit of tidbit that helped me out, is that my way of managing doctors used to be, I'm a numbers guy, so I like looking at reports. I just showed you some of these things. You want to get used to, let me back up. You don't want to be writing them reports and showing them their numbers strictly when you're managing them. What you need to do is find ways where someone else in your company can do that for you, and then they can tee them up for you, so you're able to talk to them about things that will help them get to that level that you know they can get to. So what I mean by that's the following. In my company, what I do is Drina will meet with my associate doctors. She will go over the report. She will show them, which I'll show you in a moment here. She'll show them their statistics, their metrics, and show them where they're at and kind of guide them to the point where they're having their challenges at. And so by the time she's done talking to them, they've already identified the things they're challenged with. So when they come to me, she's already telling me, hey, doc, you need to talk to Dr. X because she's actually really having a struggle with getting root canals done on time, or she's having a tough time selling treatment. If you could just look at her treatment acceptance is really rough. Can you work with that? And so when I walk in there, I'm just asking them, I said, hey, Dr. X, it seems to me like you're really having a challenge with a couple of things. What can I do to help you? And that's how I always start it. I'm never going in there and saying, you're not doing enough production, your acceptance rate sucks. It's literally just asking things that they've already talked about with Dorina. So that's really been a big change for us. This is big. A lot of you doctors out there who have associates who've come on like this, especially the ones who have recently graduated, we got to get out of the, I've been to a couple offices and seen this, where you're looking at everything they do. You're looking at their x-rays. You're looking at their, and again, you got to help mentor them. Don't get me wrong. You want to guide them. But you're looking for things to go wrong. You're finding ways to kind of give them constant insight on what they should be doing better. And that gets tiring really quick. And they're not going to be really, really happy about that. And many of them will just simply, as soon as you start that, they're moving on. They're moving on. You've got to find a way not to micromanage. Get into that level where your understanding is always going to be coaching, it's going to be mentoring, it's going to be facilitating. Because if you start getting to the point where you start running them into the ground that way, they're gone. And and all of us know this, it's hard to find associates, and more importantly, it's hard to find loyal ones. I learned that the hard way, okay? This is incredibly important too. One of the things that you're going to understand, for those who are in growing practice, at certain times when growth happens, it has a lot of change. And your associate doctors need to get comfortable. And it doesn't mean they just need to understand that. You have to teach them, explain the why. Explain to them why you're doing what you're doing. Otherwise, when you're doing something that the entire other dentists in your community aren't, they're going to think you're nuts, right? They're thinking you're creating instability. They're thinking you're actually doing things that are get them in financial trouble. You have to be willing to make them understand that by constantly explaining and providing them an environment where it feels like a stable place. So even though when you guys have those busy practices, which can feel a little unstable and a little chaotic, unless you're explaining that and taking the time to make them feel that things are comfortable and they're going to be just fine, they're going to think that you're creating that environment. They're going to think that you're actually creating chaos. They're going to think they're in the wrong place. You have to spend the time. This is what I'm talking about. It's not the clinical stuff as much as you might think it is. It's the emotional mindset. It's how they feel about things. You've got to be willing to talk about things. And even though I know you guys think you're busy, and they're doctors, they're smart, they can figure it out, unless you're doing this stuff, I'm just speaking from, I've had many, I've got 6 full-time doctors, I've got 4 part-time, and unless I'm talking to each one of them about these things on a regular basis, I know for a fact that they're going to look someplace else just simply because they want to be in an environment they can do well, but they certainly want to be in an environment where they feel like they're being, for lack of a better term, valued and taken care of. And that's really what it comes down to. I think if you're not doing those things, it's going to lead you down the wrong road. And that leads into something important. I really think it's important. What I learned in the beginning of my career was that unless I was really spending the time with your associate doctors, and this goes to your entire team, but especially your associate doctors as an owner doc, I've got to the point now where you have to be willing to make time to spend time with these guys outside the office. It doesn't just stop when the office closes. I like to spend time, one of my docs here is Dr. Chang. I like to spend time with him and his girlfriend, hang out, talk dinner, have dinner with them, see how he's doing. Because I think one of the big things we tend to forget is that we think because they're getting paid so well, he got paid well, we think that as long as they're taken care of, as long as they're producing, no problem. They're going to be just fine. And I would challenge you that unless you're having those talks, unless you're taking him out to dinner, unless you're spending time to get to know him, what makes him tick, what he values, you're missing out. Because I think unless I do those kind of things, he doesn't feel engaged to me. He doesn't feel like he has to really work and get to the point of trying to understand my vision. At that point, it becomes a job. Now I think he's at a point where he gets it. He wants to be a part of our team. He's seeing the vision. He wants to be a part of this. But you have to put the time in for that stuff. So what I'm challenging all of you, as you start to grow and get busier, you still have to make time for that stuff. I think a lot of you think that makes sense. But I'm telling you, when you get busy, you get multiple associates, it's tough to find that time. But I'm going to challenge you guys, you have to do that for yourselves. Okay? So this is important. We talked about this before, a little earlier, is that you have to be willing to, this is the reason I bring this up. This is a lot of the times of the struggles, a lot of owner docs, is that they're really having a tough time getting that associate dentist mindset. So what I did is I kind of listed a few. I'm not going to read them all here, but I'm just going to challenge you guys to kind of look at how the associate dentist looks at your practice rather than focusing on him just simply driving his performance. This is important things to understand, okay? So this is just some things we talk, people always ask, well, how do you do, when new doctors come on board, how do you deal with that? So again, what I do is I don't basically do it all on my own. So in my practice, what I like to do is our onboarding process is the following. Obviously, there's an offer in the contract, but what we do is that now when they come in, they don't meet with me first. I mean, obviously when we hire them, they come to the practice, but when they come to our first day, they spend that day with Drina. And Drina is talking to them about core values. She's talking about how we handle our insurance. She talks to them about the paperwork. She's answering all the logistical questions they have and is going over a litany of information that they typically need to know and more importantly have to know so they're comfortable in your organization. So she's dealing with number three, doctor orientation. She's going through everything from expected behavior, doctor policy, how the professionalism should be in our practice, goals. She's going through all that stuff before I even get to them. And the reason I want them to do that is because I want them to understand it isn't just between me and them. They're now part of our team. They have now a level of accountability to our entire practice and my team, and then they feel as if they're a part of something rather than feeling they're just kind of working for Dr. Lewis. Does that make sense, everyone? So I think if I can challenge you guys on that, a lot of you have been thinking about, well, what do I do? How do I get these doctors aboard? Do I have to introduce them to the patients? Do I have to? I honestly think that if you get them to the point where they kind of get integrated with your team first and the team buys into them and they buy into the team, it just happens naturally. It just becomes a natural byproduct where basically your team will get them to the point where they're introducing them, they're taking care of all the things that needed to get comfortable in the practice. So it's not beholden on the owner to be the guy making that transition to the patients. Because I've run to experience the same thing that a lot of the larger guys have noticed is that as much as I've had patients who only want to see me, I mean, once they get it, if we design it well and do it well, and if your team is buying into them and they're buying into what your team is doing, you're just trying to create the same level of service that you would provide them. And that's the whole thing about it. As long as you have that level of service up to par, they're not going to really care about really what doctor. And I know some of you feel differently, but I haven't seen that in my organization. So this is another thing. Always people are running into this. This is calibration. This is incredibly, I learned this from Dr. Declan Devereaux. Calibration. This is incredibly important. So for those who are going to get associate, who have associate, and so some of you probably already know this, what you want to obviously avoid when you have doctors seeing many of the same patients, each one of them are seeing together, you have to have your philosophy consistent. One of the biggest ways to destroy your practice is to have doctors with different philosophies, giving different treatment plans to the same patient, and just screwing up all the trust they had for your practice. So it's incredibly important. So what we do is that we basically have meetings regularly and calibrate ourselves. And what I mean by that is that we'll get everyone together, we'll show cases, we'll talk about essentially kind of what we're trying to accomplish in terms of the calibration, like what we're diagnosing. So we know when we look at certain conditions, we're going to probably recommending a crown in this instance. We're going to probably recommending veneers in this instance. So we kind of along the line are all kind of coming to agreement. And just so you know, we're not being dogmatic and saying you can only do this because that'll create dissension. But we're kind of getting into that comfortable level of like, we're going to be very close to one another. And if you're not calibrating your doctors, you're probably having a lot of problems with patients right now, not trusting your practice. That's what I would probably tell you. So calibration is incredibly important for you. So one of the things that other docs talked about, incredibly important. I think I talked to Gabe about this. Gabe had a discussion with me at lunch, and he was saying, like, well, you know, what do I do about this staff? We're not getting along. We seem to be kind of running into situations where they're having different mindsets of what they want to accomplish. I think, and this might sound kind of hokey, but this is incredibly important. Core values, I think, set the tone to provide your team and your practice a means of understanding where you guys are at in terms of how you're making your decisions, in terms of what's expected of everyone. And what we do in my practice is that we have our core values on a big poster put up in the doctor's office, in the break room. We have it out in our reception area so our patients see our core values so they can hold us accountable to them. I would tell you this is one big thing. At the beginning when I first did this, I thought, what a bunch of crap. This is just something that's not going to really resonate. And it's made a big difference because now people are held accountable to exactly what we're trying to promise to patients and each other. So building better systems, this is the thing I talk about doing. You have to get good at managing by numbers. You have to get away from people talking about feelings. As much as it can get very sensitive about certain things, you've got to be willing to stop saying, especially when you guys talk to your team, get feelings out of it. There's too many things that can go wrong if you're not doing it on numbers. It's going to cause havoc for you. We talked about the leadership meetings, SOPs. I want to show you a little bit about some of the reports we do. So I know you guys can't read that, but let me explain what it is. So I have different ways of tracking statistics. This is something that's important for your team, especially your docs and your managers to see. You're tracking essentially how your docs are doing by looking at a number of different things. I think every doc has probably talked about this. It's like a scoreboard or a dashboard for us. Like we're tracking every day what their production is or collectible production is, how many exams they had, what their acceptance rate was on those exams, what they're doing per hour. We're looking at things like average treatment plan value, and all the things need to be done because this is the stuff that's going to allow you to actually figure out how you're doing fluidly rather than waiting for the end of the month. This is the stuff that you're going to see that allows you to kind of catch things that are going wrong, and your team working with the docs, your team seeing these things so you can actually change things fluidly rather than getting caught in a crisis down the road. So this is one of our things. We look at treatment plan acceptance and doctor statistics. This is my data. So this is a report that gets sent to me every day on my phone. So every day on my phone, I'm sent what the daily production was, what our goal was, whether we're over or under our goal. I'm seeing how many hygiene patients we have. I would encourage you, I would make this available to every single person in your organization because it lets you guys see exactly where you're at on a regular basis. Your team needs to understand it. Be transparent about this stuff. I mean, if their goals are associated with your numbers, let them see how they're doing. So it's incredibly important, I think, doctors will be looking at this daily. Here's what I use for our statistics on following our doctors in our practice. So I showed you earlier kind of more of a spreadsheet. This is one that we run through one of our softwares here. And actually, this isn't software. You made this one, right? Yes, Adrena made this for us. So what this essentially shows me is exactly kind of looking at what the doctors are, how they're doing, what their production's like, how many hours they worked, production per hour. And it doesn't show it in the bottom here, but we're also seeing kind of their average daily production. So the doctors are able to see this. So now, rather than me having to talk to them or Adrena having to talk to them, they see this every day. So this is something that shows their overall. But what we really have them focus on is this stuff. This is incredible. This is important stuff. So this is the stuff that I look at. I would actually spend most of my time on looking at because this is the stuff that tells me exactly how each doctor is performing. So what you're seeing there is on the exam doctor, it just talks about how many exams they have, from those exams, how many treatment plans, what the number of the actual full cost of treatment recommended that day was, and the average exam value. Remember we talked about the Dr. Bickling? So we look at that number very closely now. And again, I think that's another takeaway for a lot of you out there to learn too, is that if you look at the doctors who are keeping their treatment plan values between $1,000 to about $1,500, about maybe $1,500, those are the ones typically who are doing the best in the practice because they're able to keep things in the budget of the patient. So what we found that in our practice at Pearl Ridge is that we can go to about $1,200 to $1,500 is that sweet spot for us for treatment plans. But at my wildlife practice, we have to go between I think it's $1,000 to $1,050. So that's incredibly important to look at regularly because then you can talk to your doctors and really give them feedback on exactly what they need to be doing in their treatment plan so we're not losing patients out the back door because you over treatment plan them. So that's incredibly, so I'd really recommend you guys do this so you can see this on a daily basis, exactly how they're doing. So they talked a little bit about EOS. We're big believers in that too. Part of EOS, part of the traction is that there's a meeting style called Level 10. And I won't go into all the details, but the Level 10 of meeting agenda is in that book. And it talks a lot about how to keep your meetings on target. So I don't want to read through all this stuff, but essentially what it comes down to is rather than it being a crisis meeting, rather than being a lot of yelling and screaming, this kind of meeting template will help organize your meetings so you're able to kind of go through every single thing you need to go through that's important in the practice, but also give the proper amount of time to it. So again, I don't want to read all that. I mean, you guys are going to be able to see that in the book, but I'd encourage you guys, when you have your meetings from now on, look at this. I'm going to encourage you to read. Look at that agenda. I'm telling you, this stuff is really organized. This stuff is a report. It's a really brief way of looking at your practice and your leadership team, so you're not wasting your time creating a lot of havoc in your meetings. I'd encourage you guys all to read that part. Okay. So, again, this is how the meetings typically work, and this is what I really am proud of. I'm not the one running the meeting anymore. It's literally run by Drina and my leadership team, who will actually go through these things without me being involved in it. So the issue for me is that you guys need to get really kind of comfortable with having a leadership team who run the practice rather than you doing it yourself. Okay. So this is something I just wanted to share with you guys. One of the things that I think a lot of you see, you're seeing these graphs that are all kind of pushed up in the right direction. I want to basically be honest with you guys. As you guys go through this, you guys are not going to have this level of overnight success. It's not going to work that way. What you're going to see is that right one. That's what's going to happen to you. I'm just telling you. Get used to the failure. Get used to the curves and the ups and downs. You have to get comfortable with that. But I'm just telling you, you've got to be willing to push forward. It's going to happen to you. Any of you who do this, any of you who really basically push yourselves to do what Chris is telling you to do, you're going to face a lot of that. I mean, there's the old adage, what they're saying is easy, but it's not so easy. But I'm just telling you, just get ready for it, because you're going to have a lot of these issues happening. But get comfortable with that. So again, I'm going to wrap up with kind of giving you some little insight here. I mean, when this happens to you, you're going to have some turnover. There's going to be resistance to change. You're going to fail a lot. But you just can't dwell on that kind of stuff. You're going to have to get more comfortable. You're going to have to get more bulletproof. You're going to have to get to a point where you're going to be willing to persevere and not get distracted to the point of giving up. That's going to create havoc for you, your family, your team. Just get comfortable understanding that it's going to be rough on the way getting there. So we talked about this before. You're going to manage by statistics. Please don't do it on emotions. If there's one thing you can tell your team is when they talk to you in the future, if they start with, I feel, just smile and stop. Okay, I know how you feel, but can you show me the numbers that actually substantiate the feelings? Just be willing to actually get them to do that for you. That'll help you make a lot better decisions to your practice. Another big thing, I'll go to the last one. Again, trust is key. I trust Drina, I trust Josh, I trust my leadership, I trust my associates, but you have to verify. The Bahamas concept can work, but you have to constantly check in. You have to verify. You just can't, there is no turnkey operation out there. There's no great operation that is simply running it from the Bahamas without actually truly checking in on a regular basis. So in conclusion, I mean, what has to happen for you guys is that being business-minded has to happen. If you want this to happen for yourself, that has to go on. You have to start to get willing to put time and effort into it. Most of your time needs to be into running on the business. You have to be willing to get out of the chair if you want this, and not just for the reason of saving your back, but to help your organization truly do well. Got to be a mentor. Being a mentor is gigantic in your practice. I think one of the things that sometimes doctors think as you get bigger and you're not in the chair anymore, you know, I'm just out of the office, just like taking my time. Now most of my time is literally just mentoring my team, my doctors, helping being at meetings, encouraging people. Like I've always told Drina, I said, what I really want to do around the office is walk around and high-five people and then ask what I can do to help them. So we talked about this before. You had doctors. These are the books that I'm a really big believer in. If there's going to be some books you're going to read, I would start with Traction. We talked a lot about it already in my presentation, in the last presentation. But these are great books to start with. If you're having a struggle with just trying to wrap your mind around being a business owner or getting to the point or getting past that small doctor mentality, The E-Myth is great. That's probably one of the first books I ever read when I started thinking about this. It's a great book. It's well written, and it just gets you out of that level of like thinking to myself, well, I can't do it because I'm a dentist. This will get you past that. Okay? So this is the one thing I'm always, and I talked a little bit earlier about it. You know, we really, I always find it funny because I'm having doctors ask me like, well, what was the one thing you did? What was the one thing that made all the difference? And there really isn't anything, really. I mean, and I keep saying it again and again, it really comes down to your ability to move forward. I mean, that is, and I just learned that this past year, again, back in July, when things are at their worst, when things are really bleak, when you're actually willing to, you know, just cash it in, you have to be willing to go through that. And if you, because I got to be honest, I mean, and it was a great learning testament to this, is that in July, I was going to sell the practice. If I got to that level and didn't put the time in to really just kind of digging in, we want to see in the growth we had this year. So those are the things I would teach you. If you're willing to just suck it up, if you're willing to push through that, amazing things can happen for you. And this is important. I think also, docs, as you do grow, as you do better, please be humble. I think that one of the biggest things I'm always telling my docs is that we can all do great, but please be humble and appreciate those around. I'm very appreciative of my team. I'm appreciative of my wife for putting up with me. I'm appreciative of people in this room who have taken care of me. There's so many great people. And I think what we're so lucky in Chris at is that we have events like this to kind of bring us together so you can all kind of feel you're a part of this tribe who's trying to get better, right? Reach out to each other, help each other out. But as you guys are all doing better, and all of you guys are going to do great, be humble, be open. That's why I love helping the Dales. I love talking to other doctors. I mean, I welcome that, and I don't need any money. It's just, for me, it's just a level of like, man, I've had such great things that have happened to me. I have to kind of I got to keep pushing that forward. And I think that if you guys start having that kind of vision, your life gets better as a byproduct of that. You're going to do much better. So this is the last quote I'm going to leave you. This is something I give to my associate docs. And I kind of leave this a quote for them. And so a lot of these guys, you know, they're kind of asking, well, how do I get to the point? Or what, you know, can I get better? How do I get better? Well, how do I go about really getting to the level of excellence? So I just kind of get used to talking and coaching. This is one thing. This is a quote I left for my docs. There has to come a point in time where you need to look inside and tell yourself, I'm tired of getting motivation from someone else. If you truly want to be great, you should not require exterior pressure or influence. You should be wary of looking outward to get your inner strength. It must come from you. Ultimately, once you can look inward and say, okay, I need to do this, then you know that's never going away. If you get that from someone or something else, it's simply going to fade away. So excellence is ultimate accountability. It can't be faked. It can't be provided. It has to come from within. And this is an important thing. It requires one earning and continually maintaining every bit of it each and every day. So thank you very much. I appreciate you guys listening to me today. Have a great evening.
All right, thank you. We are going to take a 15-minute break, come back by 3:20 for our last presenter.